Cosmologos, Tetragrammaton, and the Logos Word. The Symbolic, Kabbalistic, and Mystic Keys to Universal Understanding by Daniel Gautier, Part 2.
Much of the teaching and theoria of Plato has been drawn from Pythagoras, and it's conjectured that he was initiated by Pythagoreans or a Pythagorean, some say Philolaus. So he's extending the principle of the Logos in his own way in his great epical metaphysical cosmological work is the Timaeus, which had influence throughout the centuries, and particularly as we will see when we approach the High Renaissance with the Platonic school at that time and the Gothic period. So this was just a seminal document, so essential to the evolution of the whole of Western philosophy. So very simply here, he states the nature of the Logos.
The world must have been constructed on the pattern, logos, of what is apprehensible by reason and understanding, and eternally unchanging, from which again it follows that the world is a likeness of something else.
So there's a lot in this simple sentence here. To extend forward in history that the world is a likeness of something else, this is akin to the principle of the microcosm and the macrocosm. Essentially, this unchanging pattern, akin to the eternal ideas, everything is a variation on this principle or a likeness of this pattern, this unchanging order. There are also two levels of the Logos. The Logos has various meanings depending upon context. And there is, be it speech, law, order, reason, word, it's quite extensive. Now, in the first sentence, he speaks of the pattern. This is that seed matrix, what I term the Pentatonic Matrix or the Primal Matrix. But then the other aspect of reason, which is the lower, more discursive reason. And that reason is used as a tool to access this unchanging pattern. And this lower discursive reason or rationalism or rationalizing helps you to understand these unchanging principles. So that reason, as opposed to principle from the Greek doxa, which is opinion, which is an observation of the changing material phenomenon. This is what most people identify with. But if you use the higher aspects of your consciousness and your human intelligence, you can begin to sort through these more illusory phenomenon and the doxa, the changing opinion of the world.
Being is that which forever is and is without generation, as opposed to that which is ever becoming but never is.
So these are the two primal principles in the Timaeus. And being is that unchanging state. It's that state of unity. Forever is, without generation. And that which is becoming is this material world. There's incessant change. And it never reaches these immanent but transcendent first principles, these seeds of the Logos, the primal inclinations. And again, the being is the masculine principle in terms of polarity, and the becoming is the feminine principle, the world of change. So here we have two other principles that we find in the Timaeus. And one is Plato's lambda. It's basically a generation of the material world from singularity. So it has a kinship with the Tetractes, so the same shape, upward pointing triangle. And here we have generation in terms of singularity, the square and the cube. And everything is extended through this numerical expansion. And later on, we have, akin to an elemental generation, and he uses the figures of the regular polyhedrons. And each of these configurations, each of these symbols or models represents one of the elements. The tetrahedron is fire, the icosahedron is water, the octahedron is air, the cube is earth, and the dodecahedron is spirit. I mentioned earlier some linkages with Neoplatonism and Pythagoreanism in the High Renaissance, particularly in Florence. And again, this is one of the lectures of the Logos lectures. And one of the great embodiments of this whole tradition, this esoteric Hermetic tradition, is embodied in Raphael's fresco, The School of Athens, which is in the Vatican, in the Stanza della Signatura. So we have a lot of these preeminent figures that we have already spoken of. And the central figures, but we have Plato on the lower right, and in his hand he's holding the Timaeus. And we were talking earlier about the upright line, the vertical line, which is the axis of the spirit and the masculine principle, and the feminine, which is the material principle. So we have, this is an encapsulation of the two great philosophers, Plato and his student Aristotle. Plato's ultimate concern was with the unseen, the unmanifest, the cosmic source, expressed in his models in the Timaeus. Aristotle had an interest in these logoic principles, but his concerns were more on the material plane, in terms he's holding the ethics, which is how humanity needs to conduct itself, and things of classification of species, the material classification. And an interesting distinction, which basically distinguishes the materialist from the spiritualist or esotericist, is that Plato is pointing up to the sky. He believed that there was a realm beyond this world, which you cannot see, which embodies these unchanging principles and ideas, what he called the eternal ideas, or forms. Aristotle believed that these unchanging ideas could exist, but there wasn't a separate world. It was perhaps in the fiber of our being. But this is not a world that we can access with our consciousness, surely when we're not alive. And just to point out the other two great figures that we've discussed, which is pictured in the Raphael's fresco. In the center, we have Heraclitus thinking. One of his preeminent nickname was the Dark. It referred to a certain pessimism, but more than that, it referred to his obscurity. He was considered enigmatic, partly because it's difficult to grasp. On the left, we have a painting of Pythagoras, who's writing in the book. On the slate, one of his students has written down the Tetragrammaton. So consciousness and promulgation of these ideas was preeminent in the High Renaissance, particularly in the Platonic Academy of Marsilio Ficino, who's associated with Cosimo de' Medici. And around this school were the great artists, initially Botticelli, Raphael, Michelangelo, and later in Germany, Dürer, were also affected by these teachings. And in particular, the translations of the Platonic works by Marsilio Ficino. And again, we'll go into great detail in the Renaissance lecture on the extension of these ancient ideas and transmission onto the modern world. Philo-Judaeus was a crucial figure in the extension of these Platonic ideas onto the Western Christian and Judaic world. And he interpreted the Hebrew scriptures in the context of Greek philosophy and providing a bridge between the two. Again, a significant part of his teaching concerned the Logos and its significance. And he here mirrors what has been said by his antecedents, his philosophical precursors.
Without an incorporeal archetype, Logos, God brings no simple thing to fulfillment.
Another expression of this seminal idea, which is at the root of these lectures and the root of all creation.
The Logos is antecedent to all that has come into existence, the eldest and most embracing of created things.
So these initial abstract, all-inclusive impulses determine all subsequent forms. An interesting variation, he applied the Logos to Moses as an embodiment of the sacred reason, the divine reason. And we will see subsequently how this notion was applied to Jesus. And Philo was the great intermediary between these two notions. So Moses was the sacred reason, the sacred word, who brought the word of God through the Pentateuch and the Bible, particularly the first 5 books, made this word manifest to the world. And he considered, not surprisingly, that the Timaeus, after the Bible, is the most authoritative of all books. And his intention was to some degree, synthesize the two, though the Bible took ultimately precedence. Now, the word is very well known to Christianity in the context of the book of John, the last gospel. And by many or most scholars, it's believed that the book of John was written in Alexandria about the year of 90 AD. And at this time, Alexandria was the great hotbed of syncretism. Syncretism is a reconciliation of different philosophical and religious traditions. So these ideas were exchanged in these different formats and different contexts and different traditions. So we had the Platonic schools, the Middle Platonists, we had the Jews, the esoteric Kabbalah perhaps, and all these traditions intermingling and borrowing. So it seems likely that John, and some have said that the book of John was written by a Gnostic named Cerinthus. This is all speculation, but it is definitely the most Gnostic of all of the Gospels. And Gnosticism, of course, from the Greek meaning knowledge. But the knowledge it refers to is not the lower rational discursive knowledge or the doxa, the opinion that Plato talks about, the lower form. This gnosis is an immediate knowledge and union with these absolute higher principles, be it expressed in the terms of gods or the God or eternal ideas, the Platonic eternal ideas. Basically, it's this primal pattern and primal consciousness from which everything is derived. And in the book of John, the very beginning, he's providing another context, couching the principle of the Logos in different terms.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the same was in the beginning with God, and without it was not anything made that was made.
Very clearly a recapitulation of everything we've been speaking of. The beginning was the Word, this Logos, this unmanifest Logos, and it was with God, and we will later get into the early Christian fathers, Clement of Alexandria, who provided different levels and chronological progression of this word. And the first word was called the Logos in Diathetos, which is unmanifest, unseparated from the one. And that's, the word was with God. It was indistinguishable from the source. And it was God. It was pure being. And later on, we have a second word, which is the spoken word and prophorikos, which becomes the Christ and Jesus as an embodiment of this word, and as speaking of this world out into the world, and transforming the world in the image of the original and ultimate word. Now we have an alternative to the Gospel John, an extension of the word in terms of the Gnostic tradition, which is the esoteric or mystical teachings of Jesus that, to a degree, were suppressed by the Orthodoxy and what became the Catholic Church. And it's believed that Jesus had this secret teaching that was received by a select disciples, and those are embodied in the Gnostic Gospels of Thomas and others. And that the two recipients of this mystical teaching were John the Evangelist and Mary Magdalene. And I have written a book called Mysteries of the Christos, which addresses this history and the evolution of these ideas and the mystical teaching of Christ. And one of the cosmological treatises of this Gnostic tradition is the Apocryphon of John. And Jesus is speaking to John, and this is what he says about the Logos.
It was from the Holy Parent, the completely perfect forethought, the image of the invisible one, that is, the Father of everything, through whom everything came into being, the first humanity.
So here's another expression of this basic principle we have been discussing. The Holy Parent, which is the absolute, the Pythagorean monad, or the Tetragrammaton of Moses. Completely perfect forethought. That's what the matrix is, or akin to that. It is the first thought or conception of creation in the most abstract yet all-inclusive form. And the image of the invisible one, the Father of everything. And that image can be understood as the Tetragrammaton or the Tetractes, those two visible models, through whom everything came into being, the first humanity. And that's actually a reference to a Kabbalistic idea and the Adam Kadmon, which is the archetypal humanity, the first son of God. And the Adam before manifestation, before he enters even the Garden of Eden and undergoes the separation into masculine and feminine parts, which was adumbrated in the generation of the Tetragrammaton and the Yod and the Vav. Now, I provide an analog to these two models, which I term the Pentatonic Matrix. And it's just a set of 4, and by extension 5, the X, or the unmanifest principle, which we find in Aleph and the Tetragrammaton and Judaism and the Kabbalah. But these are my symbols, which, like the Tetragrammaton, the Tetractes, the image is suggestive of these first principles, and the upward vertical line, which we have referred to in terms of the lingam in Hinduism and the principle of fire. And the second, we have basically the infinity symbol, or the two circles, and that's the division of the singular perfect circle, the perfect forethought, which divides to create a mirror portion. And it is that process of division or replication, reflection, kind of a mitotic process, that's referred to implicitly in Exodus. And when God looks across the face of the water, basically this absolute, the Logos, the perfect Father, is projecting itself into this receptacle, the feminine material principle, and just thus creating a division, which is again united in the circle, again the sun that refers to the SON and the SUN made manifest. And beneath that, that's the division of the soul from the perfection of the two circles in the infinity sign to the oval. And that's a reference to the soul, which has circularity, but it doesn't have the perfection of the circle. And then again, you have this line, this energy, the eros energy, or the ego energy that divides the subject and the object. And the whole point is to return to that unity and reverse the cycle and reverse the process, as you do in the Tetragrammaton, coming down through the Yod He Vav He and returning He Vav He Yod. And this is what I wrote as a definition and my understanding of the Logos.
The Logos is the secret seed of all creation. The Pentatonic Matrix is the ceaseless font from which all life and form issue. The Logos is the first principle of cosmic formation. The Logos is the singular seed of creation from which all forms are derived. Through the endless repetition of this primal imprint, the pressing of this divine seal upon the fabric of matter, the unmanifest one becomes complete, fulfilled, and self-realized.